And this is where it gets scary.
This is my 2004 Volvo S60R. From the outside, it kind of looks like any granny mobile. But instead of a normal S60, this is an S60R. It has 300 horsepower, all-wheel drive, Brembo's active suspension, and mine has a 6-speed manual transmission. I've immensely enjoyed owning this car for a year, and I've put a ton of miles on it. It now sits at 164,000 miles, and over the past year of owning it, I've done a ton of work to it.
I'm sitting in front of the car because today I want to talk about my ownership and the maintenance that I've done to this car for the past year of owning it. Being that it is now a 19-year-old, somewhat higher performance car, that's pretty complex from Europe. It does love maintenance, and I've done just a ton of it this past year. I've really enjoyed it though. It's been very much a learning experience for me. I've learned to do so many new things just being forced to maintain this thing because I want to keep it driving and I want to keep it driving well. I've also priced out all of the maintenance that I've done to this thing so you can get an idea for what this is going to cost. And what I think will be fun is that I price it out in two different ways. So the first way is what I paid, which is pretty much the cost of the parts since I did all the labor on this car myself. And then the second price is if you were to do all this maintenance at a local, reputable, independent Volvo repair shop that I personally would trust to do the maintenance on this car. I bought this car for $6,000 just about a year ago. I paid that much because it is a manual transmission and they are just that much harder to find. You want the Spaceball shifter, you want to be able to drive this thing with the manual. So if you want a car like this at this kind of mileage, I think you should expect to pay that, if not a little bit more. I think a worthwhile trade-off is that it is a California car. It was two owners within the same family, and there is not a spot of rust on this thing, so it is really nice to work on. Anyway, let's get into the car. When I bought it, there wasn't that much wrong with it actually. A couple cosmetic things, but nothing like immediate that needed changing. The first two things I want to talk about are the only things on this list that I would consider optional, like modifications that are for fun and that you could probably scratch off this list if you purely were interested in just the maintenance costs. The very first thing I did when I bought this car was an IPD exhaust because I did just want to hear that 5-cylinder engine. It had the stock exhaust on it, which has a nice little bit of tone to it, but it just was not quite what I was looking for. So an IPD exhaust, oval tube, $624. If you were going to get that done at a shop, probably add $100 to it, and it sounds incredible. So I'll put a quick little sound clip here. The next thing I did was I bought a set of OEM badges for the back of the car because they were missing. I don't know, I just don't love the look of a debadged car. So $200 for a set of OEM Volvo badges from FCP Euro. Definitely pricey, but just like for me, it was one of those personal things that I really wanted on the car. So those are the two things that you could probably take off this list if you were purely interested in the ownership cost of this car. But now let's get into some real necessary maintenance that was required to keep this thing running. And this is where it gets scary. The first thing this car needed was a set of engine mounts. You could kind of just feel the car lurching back and forth when you were on and off throttle, and it just felt a little bit sloppy. So a set of engine mounts cost me $242. There's actually 5 of them in this car, and I bought them all OEM except for the top engine mount, which is an IPD mount with a poly bushing in it. Get ready for this. If you were gonna do this at a shop, all 5 engine mounts would cost you $1,300. Ouch. Why does it cost $1,300? Well, first of all, the parts, and then there is just 5 different engine mounts that are in 5 very non-conveniently located places. This is not a Honda where you just look in the engine mount's right there, 2 bolts and it's out. And it's actually the R specifically, or any kind of all-wheel drive turbo car, that makes them a lot more difficult to get to. On my Volvo V70 wagon, it was pretty easy while we had the engine out. But if you were just gonna do it on a car like this at a shop, $1,300, a ton of stuff just has to come off for like the front one, and then the side engine mount has to be done through the wheel well, and then the back engine mount is buried away by the angle gear, and the turbo makes it really hard to get to. And then the top one is pretty easy to access, but you still gotta unbolt that whole strut bar. So $1,300 at a shop. I bought this car in the spring and it was kind of cold out still, so I didn't test the AC when I bought it. It worked just a little bit, but when it got really hot in the summer, it just could not keep up, and I was cooking in this car in the LA heat. It turned out to be an AC compressor, which cost me $237 for the AC compressor. I think that's kind of standard. No Volvo price part inflation there. I paid another $99 for the Freon discharge and recharge, so add that to the total. It is a ton of work to do. The alternator has to come off, a bunch of stuff on top of the engine has to come off, the fan shroud has to come off because it's just like buried way down there at the bottom of the engine bay, and it's not accessible from the bottom. So to do that at a shop is $600 plus also the Freon. While that was off, I also did a serpentine belt and tensioner for it, which was another $100. This is where we get into some real Volvo R issues. I had a leak coming from a seal that was between the transmission and the angle gear. This was kind of something I read about online. The angle gear coming off is a huge job, and you know, it just happened one day. I noticed before that the engine was kind of just a little bit damp, but then one day I looked under and it just was actually like dripping fluid, and every time I parked there was a puddle of manual transmission fluid. That was not a good time. I had to pull off the exhaust, downpipe, drive shaft, then remove the angle gear, and off comes my problematic little seal. All of that work just to get to that. Oh well. And then I was able to replace all the seals. Now this is kind of a case of the while I'm in here's, because there's just so many seals in this system that you want to replace, because if one is going bad, like the next ones are on their way out too. So I bought a angle gear seal kit from IPD, and it cost me $181 for all of the external seals in the angle gear, the new vent tube in the angle gear, new crush washer for it, angle gear fluid, obviously all the axle seals. So it's good to know that all of that is kind of refreshed. At a shop, this would cost you a whopping $1,300. Not a fun time, not something you want right after you buy a car. My angle gear is finally in the car. It was a huge pain, and I never, ever, ever want to do it again. I think it happened to me about 2,000 miles into my ownership. $181 though, not too bad, and I actually really enjoyed doing it.
Ever, ever, ever want to do it again.
Getting to see the condition of my collar sleeve, which looks like it's been replaced before, which is nice to know, because the collar sleeve is the common failure point in the all-wheel drive system. I mean, there's many other failure points, but that is the most common one. And mine definitely has been replaced at some point, so that was a nice surprise to see. While I was doing that, manual transmission fluid is something I changed just because I was already pulling the axles out of the transmission. Didn't know if it had ever been done before. Manual transmission fluid for this car will cost you $71 for a bottle of OEM fluid. The transmissions are expensive, so I figured, you know, I'll just put in the OEM stuff. Probably $120 at a shop, so we'll add that to the list. Something that was wrong with the car from the day I bought it was a clunk going over bumps, and I never really knew what it was. It's kind of one of these things that's hard to figure out, especially if you're inexperienced like me. Eventually, after a while of just working on the car in other places, I noticed that one of the strut tops was like kind of mounted incorrectly. It didn't quite sit the way that the other ones did. So I pulled the strut out and I replaced the mount and bearing, And sure enough, that completely got rid of my clunking noise. That was quite a lot of work though, because the whole shock assembly had to come out of the car, had to come apart, replace the strut top, put it all back together, put it back in. That would cost you $400 at a shop. Up next, something I'd been putting off for a while was the front brakes. They sounded really squeaky. The rotors were warped. Like when I would go down a hill for a while, the wheel would just start to shake. And so I replaced the front rotors and pads, and in parts alone, that was $310. I think that's largely because of the bigger 330 millimeter rotors on this car. If you were gonna do that at a shop, 450 bucks. In my ownership of the car, I also did 2 oil changes at $64 each. That's what an oil change costs from FCP Euro. At a shop, $105 a pop. So we'll add 2 of those to the total. And then it came time for another big ticket item, the timing belt. My timing belt was already starting to show cracks. Like when you pulled the cover, you could see some cracks in the belt itself. They were pretty small, but word is that the tensioners actually go bad before the belt does, and that's usually how these fail. So I ordered a timing belt kit, which cost me $284. Another common thing to do while you're doing the timing belt on these cars is the VVT hubs. Over time, they have too much like in and out play in them. Mine definitely had that, and there was kind of a stumble, a very small one, at a very specific RPM. I want to say it was around 2,800 or 3,000. And it was just kind of every time as I was slowly accelerating, I would feel just a little lurch, and changing the VVT hub fixed that. The VVT hub comes in at a pricey $305 just for one of them. I only did the exhaust side because my intake side was still very solid, so I didn't feel the need to replace that one. While you're in there, an extra 35 bucks for camshaft seals and a new O-ring for the VVT hub that I didn't replace. The timing belt at a reputable shop, to have it done right, costs $1,200. That does include replacing camshaft seals as well. Add another $305 for the VVT hub itself. Just for the part, it already has to come off anyway when you're doing the camshaft seals. So a total of $1,505 if I was gonna do that at a shop. Are you guys ready for the totals? I personally have spent $3,016 on parts to maintain this car. That kind of hurts. This car is not cheap to maintain, and I'm definitely not done working on it either. That being said, I have driven the car a ton. I've enjoyed it immensely.
Never, ever, ever want to do it again.
And I've also really just enjoyed learning to work on this thing by doing all this maintenance myself. So it is a lot of money, but I absolutely do not regret it. Now, the interesting part is the cost to do this at a shop. To do all this maintenance, it would cost $7,044 more than I paid for the car itself. I don't think that anything that happened here was some kind of crazy exception. I think people spend a lot more money than I have to drive the car for the same amount of time at this kind of mileage. With all that being said, there is still so much more to do to this car, and I'm really excited to just work on it more because I just enjoy it immensely. I hope you guys have liked the videos on the S60R thus far. It's a lot of work, but when you drive this thing, it just feels so good as well. I think it's absolutely worth it.
As you saw from that total, parts for this car are not cheap. So in the next video on this YouTube channel, I'm going to pick up a more affordable way to acquire a whole lot of parts for this car at once.